He came alone, without security, in ordinary clothes. The airport staff immediately assumed that he had gotten lost. The pilot demanded his documents, scoffed, and refused to let him board the private jet. But everything changed when security recognized his name. One phone call, and the pilot's career ended right on the runway. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments what country you're from. The sun had barely crested over the flat expanse of West Texas when the black SUV turned off the cracked asphalt and rolled quietly toward the private terminal of a sandstone airfield. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a tourist brochure, just a squat beige building with faded signage and a row of hangars that looked like they'd been built when rotary phones were still a novelty. The air carried that distinctive early heat, dry and charged with dust, and already shimmered above the tarmac. A gust of wind kicked up sand as the vehicle came to a soft stop in front of the security gate. The man who stepped out of the SUV didn't draw attention to himself. There was no entourage, no badge of status or crew to signal his arrival. He wore jeans faded by time, boots scuffed by real use, and a plain plaid shirt tucked in neat under a brown leather belt. A baseball cap shaded his face, though even without it, he would have gone unnoticed. He slung a modest backpack over one shoulder, shut the door behind him with quiet efficiency, and nodded once to the idle attendant in the booth who hadn't even looked up from his phone. He made his way toward the terminal on foot, unhurried but with that unmistakable posture, erect, centered, balanced. There was strength in the way he walked, though no arrogance. The kind of calm you either faked well or had earned honestly. He stepped through the sliding glass doors into the waiting area, and that was when it started. Behind the counter stood two airport workers, both in their 20s, both looking like they had something better to be doing. One of them, tall with a name tag that read Danny, was scrolling absently on a tablet. The other, shorter and stockier, was leaning over the counter picking his nails. When the man approached, Danny glanced up, offered a tight-lipped, distracted smile, and then did a double-take. Not one of recognition, but of mild confusion. A look people often wore when someone didn't match the mental image they'd expected. "Help you with something?" Danny asked, already sounding impatient. The man gave a faint nod. "I have a flight scheduled this morning. Charter, Arizona." Danny blinked. "You mean one of the business jets?" "That's right." Danny exchanged a glance with his coworker, who smirked. The smirk said everything. This man didn't look like someone who belonged on a private jet. He wasn't wearing tailored slacks or aviators. There was no luxury watch, no shiny leather briefcase, just calloused hands, calm eyes, and an accent touched by a lifetime of Texas dust. "Name?" Danny asked, still skeptical. "Chuck Norris." The pause that followed wasn't surprise. It was amusement. "You serious?" the other one asked, already chuckling. "Like the Chuck Norris?" The man didn't answer. He just handed over his ID with the patience of someone who'd been asked the same question 1,000 times and never once felt the need to explain himself. Danny took it, looked at the photo, then at the man, then back at the photo again. His smile faded a little, replaced with something that bordered on confusion and discomfort. But instead of stepping aside or apologizing, he held the ID a little higher, as if searching for something to discredit. "I mean, this could be fake," he said slowly. "You know, people pull stunts like that all the time." "Pretty elaborate stunt," the man replied evenly. Danny hesitated. Then, in a tone that tried to sound official, he said, "I'll need to check with dispatch. In the meantime, you can wait right over there." He motioned toward a plastic bench near the vending machines, as if he were asking a trespasser to sit quietly while authorities were summoned. The man nodded once more and sat down without protest. He rested his pack at his feet and folded his hands over his lap. Behind the counter, Danny and his colleague were already whispering and half laughing, like kids who thought they'd caught someone trying to sneak into an adults-only club. A few minutes passed. Then a third man entered the terminal. Tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. Aviator sunglasses rested high on his face despite the indoor lighting, and his every movement announced that he believed himself in control. This was Captain Blake Trenton, the contracted pilot for the scheduled charter to Arizona. He approached the counter, checked in with Danny, then turned to glance at the man on the bench. Danny gestured toward him and whispered something. Blake frowned. He took a long stride toward the bench, stopping just short of the man's boots. "Sir," he said with exaggerated formality, "this area is for clients only. Can I help you find your way back to the main entrance?" The man looked up, still calm. "I'm your client." Blake's lips tightened. "I don't believe that's the case." The man gestured to his ID, still on the counter. "It's already been checked." "I need to see your confirmation," Blake said flatly. "You can call dispatch." "Sir," Blake snapped, "this is a secure aircraft and I'm not going to waste time arguing. You're not boarding that jet without verification." The man didn't rise, didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Blake and said quietly, "This is my flight. My name's on the manifest." Blake's jaw clenched. "Right. And I'm Tom Cruise." Chuck exhaled through his nose, not in frustration, not even amusement. Just the kind of breath that meant a line had been crossed but not yet acknowledged. "I don't care who you think you are," Blake continued. "If you approach that plane, I'll have you removed." Chuck stood then, slowly, with the practiced ease of a man who had never once needed to raise a hand to establish dominance. He didn't square off. He didn't threaten. He simply pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Yeah," he said when the call connected. "I'm at the terminal. Seems there's some confusion. Can you have someone speak with their pilot? He's blocking the boarding." He listened, nodded, then ended the call. A moment later, outside the glass, a private security vehicle pulled up. Two guards stepped out, one middle-aged, the other young and athletic, and entered the terminal. Blake, sensing backup, straightened his shoulders. "This guy claims he's booked on the Arizona flight," Blake told the guards, "but he's got no paperwork. I'm guessing he's confused." The older guard looked over at Chuck. His brow furrowed. Then his entire stance shifted. "Wait, are you Mr. Norris?" he asked. Chuck nodded. "That's right." The guard turned toward Blake, who was suddenly very still. "Sir," the guard said evenly, "you may want to contact dispatch immediately." Blake scoffed. "This is ridiculous." The younger guard was already on his radio. Blake hesitated, then lifted his own and called it in. "This is Captain Trenton at Sandstone Terminal. Passenger claiming to be Chuck Norris attempting to board charter to Arizona, requesting immediate verification." There was a pause, then a reply, too quiet for anyone else to hear. Blake's face changed. "Yes, sir," he said slowly. "Understood." He turned back toward Chuck, who hadn't moved an inch. "There must have been a miscommunication," Blake said, swallowing hard. Chuck looked at him, expression unreadable. "I didn't think I needed to announce myself to board my own flight." "No, of course not," Blake muttered. "I was just following protocol." But the protocol had changed, and as he lowered the radio, a new voice came through, clear, direct, and final. "Captain Trenton, You're to be relieved of duty immediately. Do not proceed with this flight." Blake's face drained of color. Chuck's didn't change at all. He just looked down at his watch, then at the jet through the window. It was time to go. The air inside the terminal had thickened, not from heat, but from the sudden and uncomfortable weight of realization. Captain Blake Trenton stood stiffly, his radio now hanging limp by his side. Behind his polished sunglasses, his eyes blinked rapidly as if trying to recalculate what had just occurred, trying, and failing, to reconcile the man he had dismissed with the truth that had just arrived in his earpiece. Chuck Norris wasn't just a name on a manifest or an aging celebrity wandering around a private terminal. He was the charter's confirmed client, its rightful passenger, and now the center of a quickly unraveling mistake. The guards stood silently, watching, offering no more than what had already been said. They didn't need to speak. The message had been delivered from above, and everyone in the room had heard the echo of it. The two clerks behind the desk, Danny and the shorter one whose name no one had yet asked, had gone quiet. Danny's posture had shifted from amused detachment to rigid anxiety, and he stared down at the counter as if hoping it would open up and swallow him whole. Chuck hadn't moved much since the call ended. His breathing was still measured, his stance unaltered. There was no triumphant smirk, no vindication in his eyes, just a level calm that made the silence more damning. But then, from somewhere deep in the well of Blake Trenton's bruised pride, came a final flicker of defiance. "Regardless of who you are," Blake said, his voice lower now, tighter, "you approach the aircraft without going through standard verification. That's not just protocol, that's security." Chuck turned to him, his face as steady as the desert sun. He didn't speak, not immediately. The pause alone was enough to cause Blake's voice to hitch slightly as he continued. "I'm responsible for what happens on that tarmac," he added, taking a step forward. "You show up in jeans and a cap, no prior notification, no crew. What did you expect me to do? Roll out a red carpet?" From behind them, one of the guards shifted his weight and murmured something into his shoulder mic. The younger of the two turned his head slightly toward Blake. "Sir, I'd advise you not to escalate this." Escalate?" Blake snapped, suddenly defensive. "You think I'm escalating? I was just doing my job. That's what you don't seem to understand." Chuck finally moved, not much, just a step forward, slow, measured, but somehow it felt like the floor shifted. He stopped a foot away from the pilot, his gaze steady, not confrontational, just impossibly direct. In that instant, the years seemed to melt away. No one was thinking about his age or his outfit. All that anyone could feel was presence, a density that made the air thrum between them. "You laid hands on me," Chuck said, voice low. "That technician, your man, put his hands on me. You made judgments without asking questions. That's not security. That's ego." Before Blake could retort, another door in the terminal burst open and a figure hurried in, a tall man in a dark suit with a lanyard bouncing against his chest as he approached. His face was flushed from exertion and worry. He looked young, but high-ranking enough to matter. "Mr. Norris," he said breathlessly, eyes darting between Chuck and Blake. "I'm so sorry. We just got the call. There was obviously a serious breakdown in communication. Please, let us make this right." Chuck said nothing, letting the silence work its way under the newcomer's skin. The man continued anyway, gesturing toward the glass wall that overlooked the tarmac. "Your jet is ready. We've reassigned a new pilot, fully briefed. We'll escort you immediately, of course." The guards stepped aside, but Chuck remained where he was, not yet moving toward the doors. His eyes remained on Blake, who seemed to shrink ever so slightly under the weight of the moment. "I don't need apologies," Chuck said, still calm. "I need accountability." The man in the suit hesitated, then nodded quickly and turned toward the guards. "Can we clear the path?" They did, and the moment broke. Chuck slung his bag back over his shoulder and walked past Blake without looking at him again. The pilot stood frozen, fists clenched, as the legend he had tried to dismiss moved through the terminal and onto the tarmac without resistance. But the story didn't end there. The technician who had laid hands on Chuck earlier, Mark, according to the embroidered patch on his shirt, was standing just outside the entrance, leaning against the fuel truck. His face had gone pale, and the nervous energy rolling off him was almost visible. As Chuck passed, he didn't speak. He didn't even meet the older man's eyes. He just stood there, trembling slightly, as if still processing what he'd tried to do and who he'd tried to do it to. Chuck boarded the aircraft with practiced ease. Inside, the new pilot, a woman in her early 40s with a precise demeanor and the kind of respectful detachment that only comes from long experience, nodded sharply and said only, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Norris." He returned the nod and made his way to his seat. The interior was cool, silent, and elegantly understated. The world outside might have been a wildfire of noise, but in here, everything was still. Outside the jet, though, the consequences of what had just happened were just beginning to take shape. Inside the terminal, Blake stood alone now, the guards having returned to their post. The man in the suit had retreated to make damage control calls. The clerks behind the desk were whispering again, but their tone had changed. The smirks were gone. In their place was a dawning awareness that their casual disrespect had not only cost them a client, it might cost them far more. It took another 10 minutes before the terminal director arrived. By then, Blake had already been ordered to stand down and surrender his credentials. He tried to argue that he had been following standard operating procedure, that nothing in Chuck's appearance had signaled VIP status, but the director didn't want to hear it. There was video. There were eyewitnesses. And most damningly, there was the voice recording from the dispatch channel ordering Blake to step aside. "You laid hands on a client's property without verification," the director said bluntly. "You treated a recognized VIP with hostility. You jeopardized our relationship with a high-profile figure. And you did all of this because he didn't look the way you thought he should." Blake tried to interrupt, but the director raised a hand. "No. You don't get to frame this as a misunderstanding. You judged someone by what they wore and how they walked. You assumed power had a uniform, and you're about to find out how wrong that assumption was." Outside, Chuck's jet lifted off the tarmac with a steady roar, cutting through the sky toward Arizona. He wasn't thinking about the terminal anymore. Not directly, not about Blake or Mark or Danny. He was thinking about patterns, about how often this had happened. Not always so dramatically, not always with security, but with the same tone, same narrowed eyes, the same subtle message, "You don't belong here." He didn't dwell on it. He never had, but something about this moment burned differently. It wasn't just that they hadn't recognized him, it was that even after being told who he was, they refused to believe it, as if their version of reality could not stretch to include a legend who didn't meet their dress code. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He wasn't tired. He was centered, grounded, but he knew what came next. He could already feel the shift in the air, the whisper of what would spread beyond that terminal and into the wider world. Because someone had been filming. Because someone had already uploaded the footage, and because stories like this didn't stay quiet anymore. By the time the jet crossed the state line into New Mexico, the story had already begun its rapid, uncontrollable spread. It started as a blurry, vertical clip posted anonymously on a social media account with barely a few hundred followers. The caption was simple: "Pilot refuses to believe this man is Chuck Norris. Watch what happens." The video captured everything essential: the confrontation at the terminal, the dismissive tone of the pilot, the calm patience of Chuck Norris as he waited, the shift in the guards' posture once recognition clicked into place. Most critically, it caught the final blow: the authoritative voice over the radio stripping Captain Blake Trenton of his duty. In the age of viral media, substance was rarely a prerequisite for attention, but this story had all the ingredients. The mythic figure of Chuck Norris, still respected, still potent, had been underestimated and publicly slighted. The reaction online was swift, visceral, and universal. It transcended politics, generations, and even continents. People weren't just watching. They were sharing, dissecting, narrating, and reacting. By the time Chuck's jet began its descent toward Phoenix, the clip had already garnered over 2 million views, trending across platforms in multiple languages. Inside the aircraft, Chuck remained unaware of the exact scope of the storm brewing online. He could feel something shifting, certainly, but he had long since learned to separate his presence from his name. The world had a habit of turning people into symbols, especially when it was convenient. But symbols didn't breathe. They didn't feel the weight of being dismissed simply because they didn't fit someone's expectation of success. Symbols didn't get sized up by clerks behind a desk or pushed by men half their age. Chuck did. As the jet touched down and taxied to a private terminal, Chuck kept his gaze out the window. There was no welcome committee waiting, no fanfare, just the distant buzz of ground vehicles and the shimmer of heat over the asphalt. The pilot made a professional farewell, and Chuck gave a nod of thanks before disembarking with the same quiet dignity he had carried all morning. The SUV that picked him up belonged to the foundation hosting the event. The driver, a veteran with graying temples and a soft-spoken manner, offered a firm handshake and didn't ask questions. On the ride to the hotel, Chuck's phone began vibrating steadily. Texts, missed calls, emails. He scrolled briefly through the notifications, noting the names: his assistant, his lawyer, old colleagues, reporters, strangers. He muted the phone and slipped it into his jacket pocket without responding. At the hotel, he checked in under the name already reserved for him. The young man at the front desk seemed to recognize him halfway through the interaction, hesitated briefly, then handed over the room key without a word. Chuck appreciated that. It wasn't reverence he sought, only recognition unmarred by disbelief. In the suite, overlooking the Phoenix skyline, he finally sat down and opened his laptop. The home screen was already lit with headlines: "Pilot refuses to believe he's Chuck Norris, instantly regrets it." Security footage confirms it really was him. The legend lives and still has hands. Some of the titles were absurd, sensationalist, and borderline comical. Others were measured, offering context and commentary, but they all pointed in the same direction. The incident had struck a nerve. Chuck skimmed a few articles but lingered on the comments beneath them. Not the trolls or the memes, those were expected, but the people who were writing from their own experience. A woman in Oregon wrote about being told she didn't look like a business owner. A young man in New Jersey shared how security always assumed he was a delivery driver, even in his own office building. A retired professor recounted being asked to wait outside during a faculty meeting because the secretary thought he was lost. Each story was different in detail but identical in rhythm. Appearance did not match assumption, therefore legitimacy was questioned. It wasn't new. Chuck had known it for decades. In film, in politics, and business negotiations, everywhere. He had once walked into a meeting with studio executives who kept calling him Sir until they found out he was the producer, not the bodyguard. He had smiled through it then, too. But what had happened at the terminal wasn't just a misfire. It had been laced with something deeper, not just disbelief but entitlement, not just challenge but dismissal. And now the world had seen it unfold in real time. His assistant, Megan, called that evening. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've got a mess," she said. "I figured. You're everywhere. CNN, Fox, every social platform. The company that handled the charter is panicking. They've already issued a press statement saying they're conducting an internal review. You've got people begging for interviews." Chuck leaned back in the armchair, his voice calm. "And Blake?" "Suspended. Pending investigation, but you and I both know what that means." He said nothing. "I've got Maxine drafting a formal notice. If you want to push for something more official, we can." "I don't want anything official. I just want to know if they've learned anything." Megan paused. Too soon to say. After the call, Chuck stared out over the city. The lights below flickered in rhythm with a world always moving too fast, always chasing the next headline. But this wasn't just about headlines. Not for him. This was about the message it sent, to every person who had ever been questioned before being greeted, who had ever been weighed by the shallowness of another's assumptions. By morning, more videos had surfaced. Someone had recorded a part of the argument through the glass window. Another clip from a fuel technician's phone showed the exact moment Blake's posture collapsed when the radio called him off duty. Reaction videos flooded YouTube. Talk shows debated the incident. Think pieces sprang up like weeds. Everyone had an opinion. Chuck declined all requests for comment. He didn't need to explain himself. The footage had already done that. Back in Texas, the charter company's executive board convened an emergency session. There was panic. Not because a mistake had been made, but because the mistake had become visible, public, unignorable. Their PR team scrambled to control the narrative, crafting apologies, offering statements of regret, pledging future training and diversity protocols. But Chuck had yet to say anything, and his silence became its own form of presence. Meanwhile, within the company itself, the impact ran deeper. Pilots whispered about the fallout. Ground staff exchanged glances whenever the name Norris was spoken. Some tried to defend Blake, citing stress and ambiguity. Others kept their heads down, knowing full well what had happened wasn't protocol. It was prejudice wrapped in authority. Blake, for his part, submitted a formal letter to the board. In it, he outlined his career accomplishments, his years of service, and his concern for passenger safety. He stated that his actions were based solely on procedure, and that he had no intention of causing offense. What he didn't mention was how he'd mocked the passenger, how he doubted not the identification but the identity, how he had reached for force before confirmation. The board was not impressed. Neither was Chuck. A copy of the letter found its way to Megan, who forwarded it to Chuck with a short note. "Read this when you're in the mood to be disappointed." He read it twice. Not because it was compelling, but because it was revealing. The letter wasn't about accountability. It was about self-preservation. At no point did Blake ask how it felt to be dismissed on your own charter. He didn't wonder aloud what it meant to be told, on a bright morning in America, that your presence could not be real, simply because it didn't match someone's imagination. And that, Chuck realized, was the problem. It was never about the rules. It was about the lens. He closed the letter and opened a new email window. The message was brief, directed to Maxine and Megan both. Let's make it clear. If this had been someone else, someone without my name, no one would be talking about it, but they should be. So let's make it matter. He hit send. Later that night, while the internet still buzzed with his name and the pundits still bickered on cable screens, Chuck went for a walk. No security, no camera crew, just him, the stars above, and the quiet understanding that something larger had cracked open. He didn't walk to think. He had already done that. He walked to feel grounded again, to remember that beneath the noise, the real work was just beginning. Because consequences were not punishments. They were lessons, and lessons, when delivered in silence, often struck hardest of all. By the third day, the storm had not only refused to pass, it had strengthened, gained momentum, and begun transforming into something else entirely. What had begun as a moment of arrogance and disrespect at a quiet airfield in West Texas had grown into a national conversation. The internet had long since devoured the available footage, dissecting every facial expression, every pause and tone, every blink of disbelief on Captain Trenton's face. But now, the story had evolved beyond Chuck Norris. It had become a symbol, a trigger, a lens through which people from all corners of the country, and even beyond, began to look at something deeper than a single confrontation. In the hotel lobby where Chuck was staying, staff had stopped making eye contact, not from disrespect but from reverence. The story had made the morning news in Phoenix, appearing between weather reports and segments about gas prices. Guests whispered as he walked past. One woman pretended not to stare and then mouthed, "That's him," to her teenage son, who nodded and said, "The video guy?" They didn't ask for pictures. They didn't need to. Chuck was no longer just a man. He had, against his will, become a moment. He didn't speak about it. Not publicly, not yet. And certainly not with strangers. But the silence was powerful. It gave room for others to fill the void, and they did. The national networks each took a different angle. Some framed the story as a cultural lesson about perception and implicit bias. Others leaned into the sensational aspects, replaying the footage over and over with dramatic music and commentary. On one particularly tone-deaf morning show, a host jokingly asked, "What would you even do if Chuck Norris squared up with you?" Her co-host, missing the point entirely, replied, "Hope he doesn't roundhouse kick me through the plane." But for every tasteless joke, there were also measured, earnest responses. Military veterans called in to share stories of how Chuck had supported their organizations over the years without cameras or credit. Small business owners recounted times when people assumed they worked at their own companies rather than owned them. High school teachers, delivery drivers, nurses, young professionals, all of them wrote posts and made videos describing the familiar sting of being underestimated. Somewhere, amidst all the noise, a quiet shift was happening. Chuck, meanwhile, remained still. Not out of detachment, but from discipline. He had lived long enough to know when to speak and when to let the silence breathe. He met with the foundation team, attended the charity event without fuss, signed autographs for children, and posed for pictures with families who didn't mention the video but held his hand a little longer than necessary. Their expressions said everything. You were seen, you were disrespected, and you didn't lose your temper. Back at the charter company headquarters in Texas, the leadership was in chaos. Emergency meetings had become daily rituals. The PR team was exhausted, the legal department over-caffeinated, and the board of directors increasingly divided. The CEO, a man named Paul Hargrove, had spent most of his week putting out fires on the phone. He had tried to issue a strong enough statement to please the public without admitting liability. It hadn't worked. Every time a press release was published, it was met with new waves of backlash. "This isn't about Chuck Norris," one viral post read. "It's about who would have been believed if it wasn't him." Inside the company, resentment began to brew. Some employees felt the pressure was unfair, that a single mistake by a single pilot had turned into a witch hunt. Others knew better. They'd seen the culture evolve over the years, watched younger hires absorb unspoken attitudes about who looked like they belonged and who didn't. For some, Chuck's story had peeled the veneer off something they had felt but never named. Blake Trenton, suspended but still technically employed, had stopped speaking to the media altogether. His formal letter, meant to explain and soften the blow, had failed to garner sympathy. Screenshots of it had been leaked, annotated, and ridiculed online. The letter wasn't an apology. It was a defense. And that defense only deepened the anger. In a small Texas diner 2 towns away from the airfield, Mark, the technician who had laid hands on Chuck, sat alone in a booth. The waitress who served him didn't recognize him. The other patrons didn't know his name. But Mark knew what he had done, and more importantly, he knew how it had felt when it happened. He remembered the way he had grabbed Chuck's arm without thinking, the impulse to remove a man he saw as a disruption, not as a person. He had thought himself professional, protecting company property. But now, sitting beneath a cheap ceiling fan and nursing a cup of burnt coffee, he realized what he had really been protecting was his ego, not the company, not the plane, his own sense of control. The video played in his head over and over. The moment the security guard recognized Chuck, the way everyone's posture changed instantly, the voice over the radio. Mark hadn't spoken to Blake since that day. He hadn't answered calls from the company. He didn't know if he still had a job, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he deserved to. Chuck's team had remained quiet through it all, but the silence wasn't passive. It was intentional. Megan had fielded hundreds of requests for interviews, offers from major networks, invitations to speak at conferences and corporate events. Chuck declined them all. He didn't need to become a spokesperson. He didn't want to become a symbol. He had already said everything he needed to say without raising his voice. Then, on the 5th day, something unexpected happened. A retired Marine named Samuel Torres posted a video from his front porch. In it, he spoke calmly, without a script, holding a mug of coffee in one hand. He told a story about meeting Chuck Norris at a veterans fundraiser 15 years earlier. Chuck had shown up unannounced, no press, no handlers, just a checkbook and a quiet nod to the organizers. He had stayed for hours, talking to every soldier, shaking every hand. Samuel said, he never made it about him, not once. That's why what happened matters. Because if he gets treated like that, what chance do the rest of us have? The video went viral almost immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it was sincere. It was the kind of truth that couldn't be choreographed. News anchors began referencing it. Commentators quoted it. Even comedians stopped joking for a moment to replay the final lines. By now, the charter company had run out of responses. They couldn't spin their way out of it. The pressure mounted. Internal documents began leaking, Email chains, complaint records, previous instances of profiling or protocol enforcement that disproportionately affected passengers who didn't look the part. The company's culture had been exposed. That evening, Chuck received a call from Maxine, his lawyer. "They're offering a formal settlement," she said, "discretionary, confidential, they want it to go away." Chuck didn't laugh, he didn't sigh, he simply asked, "Are they offering change or just silence?" Maxine paused. "Silence mostly, but there's room to push." Chuck nodded slowly. "Then let's push. Not for me, for the next guy." The next morning, Chuck published a short statement. It was posted on a simple white background with no logos, no corporate branding. It read, "This wasn't about me. I've spent my life in rooms where people underestimate until they recognize. But not everyone gets that recognition. Some never do. And some are pushed out before they get the chance. If this moment has taught us anything, it's that power doesn't always look like what we expect. And respect shouldn't have to be earned through fame." The message was clear, pointed, and final. And it landed like a thunderclap. Major publications reprinted it. Civil rights organizations echoed it. Airline unions referenced it in their internal discussions. Other passengers, past clients of the same company, came forward with their own stories. One had been mistaken for a valet. Another was asked to prove ownership of a medical transport account he had funded. The tide had turned. That night, a board meeting was held in the upper floors of the charter company's headquarters. The CEO presented the numbers. Brand reputation had plummeted. Shareholder confidence was shaky. They needed a definitive move to stop the bleeding. "Captain Trenton?" someone asked. "Effective immediately," the CEO replied. "Terminated, not for one mistake, but for proving he couldn't see past one assumption." There were no objections. Chuck never celebrated. He didn't call the news. He didn't post follow-ups. He simply returned to his normal life, knowing that in one quiet act of restraint, a mirror had been held up to an industry and to a country. The echo wasn't noise. It was clarity. The headlines faded, as they always did. The trending hashtags slowed, the viral clips gave way to new spectacles, and public outrage turned its fickle gaze towards the next scandal waiting to erupt on a fresh timeline. That was the rhythm of modern noise, loud, fast, and forgetful. But what remained behind in the quiet was far more telling. Not everyone moved on. Not everyone forgot. And not everything that happened in that airport terminal stayed there. 3 weeks later, Chuck Norris stood again at the edge of an airfield. This time it wasn't in Texas or Arizona, but just outside of Oakland, California. A different setting, a different purpose. There were no reporters, no news crews, no crowd waiting to document his arrival. The only sounds were the soft whir of a maintenance cart in the distance and the quiet hum of wind sweeping across the runway. The air smelled of engine oil and salt from the nearby bay. The sun, still low in the sky, cast long golden shadows over the tarmac. Chuck didn't come for a flight. He had no meetings to attend, no red carpet to walk. He came because he wanted to see something with his own eyes. The new facility had been built in silence, just like the message it now embodied. Rhodes Aviation, one of the charter companies that had reached out to him quietly, respectfully, and with purpose, had extended an invitation for a private walkthrough of their updated terminal. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, but Chuck had accepted. He moved through the halls alone, flanked only occasionally by a young operations manager who offered brief explanations of what had changed since the incident. Chuck listened. He nodded. He didn't ask for more than he was told. The facility was sleek, modern, practical. No excessive luxury, just clean lines, clear policy boards, and a quiet professionalism that didn't try to prove anything to anyone. They passed a break room where two flight attendants looked up, recognized him, then looked back down, not in avoidance, but in something that felt like quiet respect. No one asked for autographs, no one interrupted. Word had likely spread ahead of his arrival, and the staff had been briefed. But it was more than that. There was a shift in how he was seen, how he was received, not as a celebrity, not as a relic of action movies past, but as a man who had drawn a line and refused to move from it. Near the main conference room, just outside the entrance to the staff lounge, hung a bulletin board. On it were the usual notices: flight schedules, birthday reminders, community charity events. But pinned to the center was a new flyer, printed on heavy stock, framed with silver trim. It featured no photos, no logos, just a short phrase, pulled from a conversation Chuck had once had with the head of Rhodes Aviation during a private phone call weeks earlier. The words were his, now displayed for everyone to read. Respect doesn't come from how loud you speak. It comes from how you carry the silence. He stopped in front of it for a moment, just long enough for the words to settle in his mind. Then he turned, offered a small nod to the operations manager, and continued walking. Outside the hangar, the sky had taken on that specific shade of blue that comes only in the early hours, unblemished, clean, almost translucent. Chuck stood for a while, looking out over the runway. A single jet rested there, the same make and model as the one from Texas, though this one bore no markings, no vanity registration numbers. Just a tool, waiting to be used. He didn't approach it. He didn't touch it. He simply looked, as if trying to understand something invisible, something that had existed beneath the surface long before that moment in the sandstone terminal. Eventually, he turned back and walked to the edge of the lot where his car was waiting. A simple sedan. He slid into the driver's seat without a word and drove away from the hangar, the terminal, and everything that had once made the sky feel smaller. But that wasn't the end of it. Back at his home in Texas, Chuck returned to the ordinary rhythms of life. He tended to his land, spent quiet evenings with friends, trained in the early mornings as he had for decades, not because someone expected him to, but because discipline wasn't a performance. It was an identity. The world had quieted, but that didn't mean the echoes had stopped. Letters continued to arrive. Not from corporations, not from talk show hosts or news outlets. From people. Real people. A former nurse in Michigan who had been asked to step aside for a man in a suit because he looked more like a doctor. A high school student in Georgia who was told by a counselor to aim more realistically because of where he was from. A retired bus driver who had been mistaken for a janitor at a family reunion held in a hotel he paid for. These weren't complaints. They weren't dramatic or angry. They were confessions. Quiet truths shared between strangers, inspired not by a fight, but by a refusal to be moved. Chuck read every one. Some made him shake his head. Others made him smile. A few made his chest tighten with something that wasn't quite grief, but close. He didn't write back to all of them. There were too many. But he kept them, filed them, remembered their names, because they mattered. One afternoon, Megan walked into his study carrying a new report. She placed it gently on the table in front of him, along with a fresh mug of coffee. "It's official," she said. "Captain Trenton's employment has been permanently terminated. Severance offered, declined. He gave a final statement, claimed he'd been treated unfairly. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of his coffee, eyes lingering on the trees outside the window. "You want me to file our closure notice?" Megan asked. He nodded. "Do it, but don't bury it." She raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Make it public, quietly, just facts, no anger, no spin." Megan understood. She always did. The statement that followed was clear, simple, and unapologetic. It detailed the incident, acknowledged the company's corrective action, thanked Rhodes Aviation for its response, and reaffirmed Chuck's belief that respect, once violated, must be restored, not with outrage, but with accountability. The industry took notice. In the weeks that followed, other charter companies began reviewing their onboarding procedures. New training modules appeared in HR departments across the aviation sector. Diversity consultants were brought in, not as a token, but as a necessary step. A quiet reform had begun, not from outrage, not from protest, but from one man who had chosen not to be provoked into spectacle. For Chuck, it wasn't a victory. It was a standard being restored, and it didn't require shouting to be heard. One morning, he returned to the airfield in Texas, not the one where the incident had occurred, but a different one, smaller, more local. He was there to meet a group of young cadets, first-time flyers, some barely out of high school. The event wasn't publicized. No cameras, no press, just a chance for them to hear from someone who had spent more time in the air than most of them had spent walking the earth. They sat in a semicircle around him in the hangar, eyes wide, notebooks open. He didn't tell them about the terminal. He didn't mention the pilot, or the video, or the firestorm that followed. He told them about control, about staying calm in turbulence, about making decisions when your instincts scream something else, about earning the trust of a machine and a crew and a mission by proving over and over again that you knew who you were before anyone else did. When it was over, one of the cadets asked quietly, "What do you do when people don't believe in you?" Chuck looked at him for a moment, then answered with the same ease he used when tying his boots. "You don't need their belief. You need your own." The boy nodded. That night, back home, Chuck poured himself a glass of water and stood on his porch. The stars were clear, the sky wide and open. He thought about the last month, not as a whirlwind, but as a slow, hard wind that had carried something heavy and long overdue. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even tired. He was just aware of how often dignity is mistaken for weakness, and how rare it is to see silence used not as retreat, but as strength. He glanced at the carved plaque nailed to the post beside him. It had been a gift, sent anonymously with no note. Just 5 words. Sometimes silence says it all. Chuck smiled, not broadly, but enough. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. The message had already been delivered. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for stories that stay with you. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.